So this is the roundtable on well-being research for libraries, museums, and archives. It's hosted by CALMA, the Center for Advances in Libraries, Museums, and Archives. Before we start, let me just respectfully acknowledge that we are located on the homelands of the Coast Salish peoples and pay respect to the Coast Salish past and present, who have lived on and cared for these lands and waterways since time immemorial, and whose practices and lives continue to enrich and develop in relationship to the land, waters, and inhabitants. Okay, so this event is a great milestone for us. We got started as a task force about 2.5 years ago. It's been a while. But it was a Dean's task force in alignment with one of the objectives in our strategic plan, which is to strengthen library and information science as a field of study, but also on this campus and in our school. So we're making really, I think, quite good progress on that. Sharon, do you have the slides? So can we see the next slide? Oh. I gotta move the slides around. I changed the slides. Oh my gosh, you don't have my slides. All right. I was working this. All right. Well, this is our mission to advance critical roles that libraries, museums, and archives have in fostering thriving communities and elevating stories of our diverse humanity. This is the last statement in the mission statement. It's a little bit longer than that, but it's the closer. It's the, the one, I guess the one we want to really project. Yeah. The thing to know though about the task force is it's really grown and evolved, over this time that we've been together. And the current focus really is on, promoting, incubating CALMA. And my slide not only had the list of our people that are the task force members, most of which are here, but also pulled out two particular really important contributors. So Sharon Streams, who is, we were very, very fortunate to attract as our director just 5 months ago, I guess it was, Director of Strategy and Operations. There she is. Amazing what has happened in 5 months relative to the other 2 years. I think we're making progress, but boy, to have this leadership. And then also David Strand, who's joined us as a research assistant starting this quarter. And so this is the inaugural event. It's the first in a series. And actually, I'm going to look at my own slides here because I did want to say something more about the foundational activities, because this is the beginning in a set of activities that we want to do that's really going to set the grounding. We hope these activities will elevate, support, build connections among the iSchool and the professional community in libraries, museums, and archives. And so we're launching it with this, well-being roundtable that, did anybody go to the Provost's town hall? Big theme.
Good for you. You win a prize.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh, 2 prizes.
I know.
But it was a big theme before she launched into AI, which is the other big theme, of course. But well-being for the campus is a priority. And so just kudos to Sharon for, selecting this as a way to launch the center and a way to really showcase how libraries, museums, and archives all contribute to something that's so essential. So I'm going to turn it over to Chris, who's going to make introductions to our panel. And we are eating after. So it's here.
So we stand between you and your food.
Say, feel free to come and get a drink. Some of you may get first. Okay, thank you.
All right, this is exciting. So we have a 4-person panel. They'll each speak for about 10 minutes. And after that, I'm going to ask 1 or 2 questions, and then we'll have the full group participate in the discussion. So in order of the presentations, there Jessica Luke, who's a teaching professor in the high school, as well as director of the Master of Arts in Museology program. And her research focuses on museums and youth development, family learning, and parent involvement. After that, we have a remote participant who wasn't feeling well. So she'll be participating on our screen here, Temi Odumosu, who's an interdisciplinary scholar and curator at school, with a focus on critical and creative approaches to understanding information technology's role within society, and in particular, how unfinished colonial histories and their inequalities haunt data, uses of information, and technology design. After Temi, we'll have Jinha and Juan Rubio kind of speaking together on a project. Jinha is a professor and associate dean for faculty affairs and director of the Gamer Research Group. So her research focuses on exploring new ideas and approaches for organizing and providing access to popular cultural media, understanding user behavior related to the creation and consumption of these media, and for using them for informal learning at venues such as libraries and museums. And Juan Rubio from the Seattle Public Library. He's an expert in educational technology who designs learning experiences with a focus on participatory design within an equity framework. So he's designed curricula for places like the Tribeca Film Institute, New York Department of Education, Brooklyn Public Library, and Carnegie Hall. He has a master's degree in media studies from the New School in New York City, and he studied film at Howard University. And right now he's the manager for digital media and learning at SPL. So that was a lot, but I thought I'd get them all out of the way so we can not interrupt the flow, but I think will be a really interesting conversation here. So Jessica, we start with you.
Thank you. Thanks everyone for being here. I'm going to talk to you about a study that we are in the middle of doing right now. So it's always fun to share when you're in the middle of something, right? Yeah. The study is designed to assess how and whether a regular old visit to an art museum, self-directed, you do your own thing, going through the galleries and exhibits, has an impact on your well-being. We're interested in two things there. One, is there an impact, either positive or negative? And two, what do people perceive might be some of the factors that contribute to that impact? And so those are the two things that we're trying to investigate. The problem that we're trying to speak to, I think, at a societal level is pretty obvious, right? I mean, there's so much mental health problems and issues going on in society. Some of you might be familiar with the Art's Own Prescription model in the UK and in Canada. It comes about largely through, a model of universal healthcare where there are some affordances in terms of how we think about health infrastructure. But in those countries, there are doctors who are writing prescriptions for people to go to art museums for some of their low-level mental health needs, which I think is really interesting and exciting and suggests, I think, the growing role that art museums might have within our mental health infrastructure. We're hoping to make a contribution to the literature and to practice. In terms of the literature, there are really two sort of bodies of research. One is really broad, studies thousands of people, makes correlations over time between visiting art museums once or twice a year, going to the theater, dance, that kind of thing, and people's health. And the other body of research is very specific, like targeted interventions in museums for specific populations, people with dementia, people with PTSD. And both of those are super valuable, but we feel like what's missing is sort of that middle ground of what happens when, more adult typical people show up at an art museum. Are there impacts for well-being during those visits? So that's what we're trying to address. We're also trying to give practitioners data that might be useful for them. That's something that always drives me in my research. So before I started this study, I pulled together 10 art museum interpreters from across the country, people whose job it is to help make connections between works of art and the visitors, right? And so they're responsible for labels, videos, print materials, interactives, all of that stuff. And I had a candid conversation with them about this study. Do you imagine that there are results from this that you put into action that really influence how you write labels, how you connect people with works of art, and, you know, thankfully they did. That's what was I gonna do if they said no? Well, I would have made adjustments, but, you know, so we had some really, I think, productive conversations about how they could see practical implications for this work, which felt to me like, that was reason enough to keep going. So, let's see, what are we doing? We're doing a quasi-experimental study that involves collecting data from single participants at 2 points in time. When people come in to the art museum and then when they're finished their visit. We are collecting, let's see what I want to tell you. I say we, I'm sure you all do this too. I'm not collecting data. I have 18 amazing museology master's students who are collecting data. A few of them who are online, maybe Yanya, Mio. Sorry if I missed someone else. I am offering a directed research group this quarter, which is how I thought I would run this study. And when I thought about it in the fall, I honestly thought if I could get 2 or 3 students to do this, this would be amazing. And 18 of them poked their heads up and said, I really want to do this. And so I had that moment where you're like, and I redesigned the study to accommodate them. And so now they're collecting data in pairs, which I think makes the interviews much richer. They're collecting data across 3 art museums instead of 1. It's required a lot of scheduling, coordinating, training, retraining, feedback, but it's so worth it. It's been really fun. So these awesome students recruit people on their way into the museum, and they do a 3-minute-ish pre-experience interview with them. Then they send them on their way and they ask them to return 60 minutes later. They give them a postcard with a time on it because we found that that incentivizes people to come back. And then they conduct a 5 to 8 minute post-experience interview with people and give them a tiny thank you in the form of a $5 Starbucks gift card. We're collecting data at 3 art museums locally: Seattle Art Museum downtown, the Fry Art Museum in First Hill, and the Asian Art Museum in Volunteer Park. And so they provide a pretty decent diversity in terms of how much it costs to go there, how big they are, what the collection looks like. How are we measuring well-being? Because that's really the point of why we're here, right? We are using existing measures that we pulled from the literature. There's a group of UK researchers who have created something called the Museum Wellbeing Toolkit. And what they did was they pulled measures from the psychological literature, specifically the PNAS, if any of you are familiar with that, the positive affect, negative affect scale, which has a ton of items that measure subjective well-being. And they did a bunch of research to say which of these sort of has the most kind of traction for museum experiences, right? And they limited the number of those from the PNAS into something nicely manageable, 12 items. 6 positive emotions, 6 negative emotions. So people are asked to rate them on a scale from 1 to 5, where 1 is, I do not feel that at all, and 5 is, I feel that fully and completely. And they do it before, and they do it after. I think personally, the more interesting thing is that we're also then trying to get them to reflect a little bit on those scores and what might have influenced them. So where we landed was we have them do their ratings on a piece of paper. And when it comes time to talk about it, we say, so let's look at these side by side. Here's your ratings from before you went upstairs into the visit, and we write before. And then we say, and here are your ratings now, and we write now. And we just ask them this question, what do you notice? And have them reflect a little bit. So that primes and gets them to talk about, oh yeah, I see that I went down here. And a lot of them will sort of start talking about it themselves. Like I went down here because this happened, and then this thing happened, and now I feel like this. Sometimes they'll just make observations about the change, and then that prompts us to be able to ask them questions. We're asking things like, you know, if they say, I feel more inspired now, can you describe a moment during your museum visit where you felt particularly inspired? And it's so fun to listen to what people say. They can talk about a specific artwork. Yeah, I was upstairs in the Calder, and in the corner, there's this piece that casts these shadows, and right, like these very specific stories about things that are contributing to their well-being from their point of view. We're hoping to have 360 matched interviews by the beginning of March. And I think we can get there only because of these 18 amazing students. Yeah. And then we'll, start analysis and figure out what we have. I think a couple of things I've noticed, you can see in the data that there's movement pre-experience to post-experience in their ratings. I don't know what direction, I don't know exactly what it means, but you can see it. And I think even more interesting, again, is the way that people are able to reflect on it. Those of you who have done this kind of in situ naturalistic sort of research know that it's super fun and super messy and super challenging, right? People don't always respond the way you want them to or think they're going to. And so I think I like that we've developed some sort of a strategy that is getting them to be really reflective and really identify some of the pieces of their visit that they think have something to do with well-being. So I'm excited to mine those data. If anyone is interested in talking further, let me know, and I'm happy to share our processes and our results with anyone. Thanks for listening.
It's gonna be really hard to go from all four, because I have all these, I'm sure everyone has questions, but I think we'll keep these moving
Yeah,
along.
jot them down, we'll come back to them.
Yes. So Temi, I think you're next. If we can, we'll first do our sound test.
Yes, I'm here. Can everybody hear me?
Yeah.
Great, thank you. Thank you so much. And Jessica, just listening to you speak, since I have the technical ability, I just wanted to share this fantastic illustration from Claire Bishop's book on
Nice.
museums and this idea of, hunky-shouldered people walking into the institution and then floating on air.
I love that.
So I'm here because I've been asked over the last year or so to do a couple of interventions into the cultural heritage space that focused on colonial collections in one way or another. I have been in a collaboration with a project called Digital Benin that is pulling together an online database that gives a sort of much needed overview of where all of the looted artifacts from the Edo Kingdom and the Royal Palace in Benin are currently. And all that material comes from different collections, but is then reorganized, resituated, and recontextualized by local voices in Benin, local educators, school children, coloring books, all sorts of things happening on this platform. And one of the things that I was asked to do was to help them think through how they might even attempt to share the photography connected to this material, which not only documents the literal looting and theft of the Benin bronzes. So you have images of British officers sitting amidst a sea of bronze plaques. I mean, these are quite well-known images, but also sharing, photographs of people in the Edo community and the Royal Palace, human sacrifices, altars that are not supposed to be seen by very few people in the community, never mind, the rest of the world, as well as photographs of the Benin bronzes in private and public collections out of Nigeria. So we've been thinking together about what the possibilities are for that. Should we share? Could we? In what ways? Who should be responsible for the storytelling? How do you involve yourself in a violence that has already happened? How do you enact forms of historical redress after the fact when it's too late? So I wrote a piece that is becoming a working document for the group called Approaching Colonial Photographs with Care. So that's one project. But the other project that I wanted to talk a bit more about today is a learning guide, I would call it, a learning tool for AM Digital, who basically do a lot of digitization works for universities and other collections and museums. And they asked me to contribute to a whole resource that they are compiling around colonial materials. And when they approached me, I think initially they just thought that I was create a video introducing colonial materials, la, la, la. And I said, no, actually, I would rather write about the effects of doing this work because it's not easy. And for a long time, I, as a researcher, had been looking for both language and support to address entering into distressing archival collections, whether that's museum collections or library collections. And so I ended up developing a learning resource called How to Deal with Documents That Cause Distress. Which caused me to think about, well, what were my own strategies, the ones that failed, the ones that I wished I had ahead of time, and the ones that worked really well. And then, you know, what other knowledge could we draw on to support this process of entering into collections that do harm symbolically. So this is second and third hand witnessing of violence of varying kinds. So what am I think as somebody who spent a long time feeling very isolated doing this work, even though I would, you know, at great expense find my way to big conferences on slavery and sugar and all sorts of things and ask all of the top scholars, like, how are you handling this? But I found that it was quite difficult to access that other knowledge, which was about, you know, why putting yourself through an experience that is harmful and then coming out on the other side and writing about it and then asking others to also approach this archive. So, of course, I have worked with and read many different scholars who have attempted to articulate this work, and people like Saidiya Hartman and Tina Kampt have been very influential in this, but also the work of other people in other fields. I remember reading the work of Resmaa Menakem, who is a somatic trauma a sort of trauma specialist and somatic practitioner, and thinking, okay, there's something here about considering how traumatized bodies reenact pain and trauma, both in historical terms and then in a present day, and sort of thinking about how I could use those approaches to think through what's happening in collections. And I'm also using teaching. So I see some of the MLIS students in the room. Hey. So we've been talking also about this, like what an ethics of care could be and how to approach this material sensitively. And is it actually possible without somehow, without harm being enacted in one way or another. So yeah, I think that's probably where I would stop, because I know that there'll be questions about it, but that's what I come to this meeting with, this sort of tentative engagement with the practice of doing colonial archive work, which is something that, you know, I'm on the edges of, you know, not doing anymore, depending on how things go. Yeah.
Thank you, Temi. And then for our joint presentation, we have Juan, Rubio, and Juan.
Yes, thanks, Gina. Well, first of all, thank you for having me here. You know, I love being in the university, and I feel at ease in the academic world. And I think that's thanks to like the heavy-handedness theoretical framework from the new school in New York. I feel okay here. But I also want to think about, like, you know, I'm a big advocate of research and practice partnerships, and the partnerships that I have formed here at the University of Washington, Regina, Jason, Cindy, have all been instrumental in creating a work that is impactful and foundational at the library. And I feel really honored to have worked with the UW and being here. So the project that we want to highlight, it's a project, that we've been working for a while about librarians providing mental health support for teen and youth. And what we found out is that there was a tension with library staff between wanting to have some structure and also having some flexibility, right? So they wanted to be able to tell me how I should do this program, but also let me be able to change it. So that tension was really interesting to us. So we came up with the idea of creating a deck of cards. It's this deck of cards that allows that process to take place, to create some structure, but at the same time, mix and match these cards so that they could create some recipes. We are using the analogy of the kitchen metaphor to allow them and facilitate this kind of thinking of structure versus flexibility. We also have this hypothesis, which is that participatory design is the perfect venue to create well-being with teens so that they can actually articulate their thoughts about mental health, but also externalize what they're thinking about it from a point of view that it's not very closely personal, but it's, they can see themselves from the outside. And then we are basing this also on the ACT therapy. If you're familiar, it's about accepting commitment therapy, right? When you're looking at yourself, accepting, taking a look at where your emotions, behaviors, and thoughts are, looking from that side, and then accepting them and making changes through it. We also created a cookbook that gives information about it, right? So that tells you, for example, like this principle of co-design for well-being and how we're connecting all of those aspects of co-design to well-being. So we're really excited. I can talk about it for a long time. But so I'm just gonna pass it to Gina.
Yes. So when Juan asked me if I wanted to work on this project, I immediately said yes, because we have had so many great projects in the past. And I knew that whatever comes from this research is also going to be amazing. So that kind of strong partnership that we have, that's ongoing, I would also say that is sort of fundamental to making these really exciting projects possible. So as Juan said, the participatory nature of this project was really, really important to us, so that we can actually invite the teens and youth to come together, and try to think about, hey, if we want to redesign our space in the library to support youth mental health, how's it going to look like? Or what kind of activities can we do together to try to check in and see how everybody's doing, right? So when we think about this project, we're not really thinking about this in terms of oh, this is some sort of intervention that's going to immediately solve all of these issues that people are dealing with. That's not going to happen, right? We're always going to have those challenges. The teens are going to go back to their school and their home, which is sometimes a great place for them to recharge, but also a source of stress in some situations, right? So in that way, we wanted this to be kind of like an opportunity where if you think about, all of these nice things that you do to sort of train your body, right? And it can be as something simple as oh, I'm just going to drink more water today, or I'm going to take a walk, or I'm going to just go and sit and not think about anything, right? And we wanted to do something similar, but for your mental health. And this project was really focused on yeah, what can we do to make it so that we have this kind of conversation like this in libraries, and make it sort of like a normal thing that we do on a daily basis, right? So it's not about sort of trying to address the crisis situations or things like that, but it's like, hey, what have you done today to take care of your mental health, right? So, it's been like really amazing to actually see the impact. We measure our impact in a much more qualitative way, because we're not having like thousands of people doing the co-design together. It's a much smaller group. But what we can do is to have an opportunity to really dig deeper and try to think about like, how did this influence you? And one thing that was really surprising to us was, you know, in addition to the youth participating, of course, they loved it. They loved having an opportunity where they can even talk about this. And they were able to kind of open up and share a lot once they actually saw that adults were doing it themselves. But also the librarians and library staff who participated, they loved it. They were like, oh my God, this was actually amazing. I had time to think about this too and talk about this. So that was really nice to see, and we are really proud of, we will circulate this. Sort of our like more theoretical contribution, which is trying to think about this recipe-based co-design model and how you can actually create tools like this to support librarians who may not have had much education in co-design, but they can easily jump in, try to figure out like, hey, I don't know how to do co-design, but I can follow this recipe and I can talk about mental health with my youth. Or you get really familiar with it and get to the point where I am gonna create my own recipe and start to share out. So that's been a super exciting part to see how each of these librarians and library staff are able to participate and also contribute to the outcome.
Thank you. So everyone's, we've heard three great talks here. I'm gonna take the moderator's prerogative and ask the first questions, and gives you time to come up with yours as well. I'm gonna start with, something Temi said, which was, she wrote about the effects, if I were to start now, the effects of doing this work was how she wanted to make her contribution. And it made me think, and I wanted to ask the others as well, when we think the effects, there's the effects of us on our, as academics, there's effects for the students, so you have all 18 students out there, and we're talking about a very challenging issue. And with the data showing that it's becoming more and more of a crisis within our communities. And then there's the effects on the professionals, whether they be the staff or the museum people. So I just wanted to see if other reflections on what effects this has for these different groups. And I mean, Jana said that the kids loved it, which is a very different, or that the librarian staff loved it. But this is also a challenging topic. So, what are those kind of multifaceted effects on these different communities that you've worked with? And didn't we just hire at the school, a mental health professional to help as we encounter these types of challenging things. So I don't know if you've had to, as you've worked with your students, Jessica, if you had to think about what impact it's having on the students to be doing these types of interviews.
I mean, we've had some conversations about that, probably not enough. Yes, I mean, I think what it makes me think of is, Temi, when you were sharing, we've had a few students who have done their master's thesis research looking at the ways in which the interactions that museum staff have with visitors, especially around collections that have some sort of trauma associated with them, what kind of a toll that takes on the museum staff and the strategies that they use to deal with that. And I think that work is really interesting, and probably we need to do more of that in museums. I mean, would you agree that there's so many people who are playing this role of connecting you to these pasts that are very, very problematic. And we think very little, frankly, about the role that it has on them.
I'd agree. We've had students who had done phenomenological studies with educators working with individuals who are incarcerated, so doing sort of art programs, healing programs. So the study was really focused on the impact on educators, and there is absolutely, from the study, it seems like there is a toll, right? There is emotional labor associated with a lot of this research. And I don't think we are focusing enough, because it leads to burnout.
Yeah.
As well.
So, we have observed that, the librarians need a lot of support, understanding the difference between crisis, and then just mental health support, right? That difference between mental health illness versus just mental health. And there seems to be a need to be explicit with the staff about understanding that difference and what does it mean. And this project is also part of a connected well-being, from the Connected Lab at UCI, from Mimi Ito. And there, I was there and having conversations about what does it really mean to provide well-being, right? One of the things that was talked about is like about consent. What does that mean? Like, when do you go to a young person and is it okay for you to ask them about things that are related to mental health illness, or is it just creating these spaces where you find support? So I think for the librarians, that's really very key to guide them in this distinction about it, right? So that they feel that they're not stepping in an area that they're not prepared to do as a mental health advisor or therapist. That's one thing. And then I was talking to Jinha, this project has a lot of components and layers, because we're introducing co-design, and then what we're asking them really is to take the role of designer, right? Not only when they design with the teams, but also when they put in these recipes together. So we're bringing all of these things into them, and we also wanted to think a little bit as like game designers, because we're introducing them to constraints and opportunities. So. But I think it's just providing that guidance and be really thoughtful about what is it that they need, and it's just like this treating it more like a human-centered design, right? What is it that the librarians really need in order for them to provide this support, these spaces? And then the other thing that we have discovered is that this is really important for them, because for me, for example, I am more aware about mental health practices with me as well, right? And we've heard from librarians also that they're more aware about their mental health and how they deal with it.
And I will talk a little bit about sort of like the effects to the youth themselves, right? So the youth who participate in our program, we're not just asking them to come to a library and like, oh, now you sit down and we're going to tell you about mental health. We don't do that, right? So we actually sit around and like try to think about these issues together and try to see things from their perspective and think about things that we could do that they think is actually helpful for them and their friends, right? So, to give you kind of like a really concrete example, right? When we think about phone use, right? And how we spend our attention, right? I think one thing that adults might approach and like try to solve this problem is like, oh yeah, let's try not using our phone. Let's put it away and try to just focus on your internal thoughts or mind, or like disconnect, right? That's like an immediate kind of thing that I think a lot of adults think about. But when we started talking to the youth, they're like, oh no, I actually am a competitive esports player. Like these devices are really important to me, or this is actually how I connect to my friends all the time. I feel the sense of belonging through this device, right? So when you try to start thinking about it from their perspective, the sort of like solution or the ideas that come from it might be very different from what we have. And I think they definitely felt that. And what was really great was, we wanted them to have that sort of like sense of agency and control of it. And like, hey, we're not here trying to tell you what you should do for your mental health, but like, what do you think we can do? right? And I think they really enjoyed that experience, their voice being heard.
Yeah.
And then, in the long term, we hope that that is going to, try to encourage them to, like, they definitely brought their friends because they really enjoyed it. But being more like the advocate themselves about just mental health awareness and well-being.
That's dysfunctional.
Yeah, and you can see all the happy youth there. So yeah, in that way, I think it was really great that they had that sort of agency and control.
And Temi, since I started with using your example, do you want to elaborate on those effects that you wrote about, or other
Yeah.
sorts of effects you've seen in your work?
I was just yesterday listening to the Women's Hour on Radio 4, which I do to figure out what's happening in the UK. And they were having a conversation a couple of days ago about a new dramatization of the effect of COVID in hospitals and with medical staff. And it's a dramatization that's based on what actually happened during the kind of epicenter of the COVID crisis, like, 25th of March, 2020, and all the sort of politics around it, but also the devastation that it caused for individual people's lives, as well as the whole collective morale of the National Health Service. And one of the things that they were talking about, both the medical doctor who co-wrote the piece, was, is it too soon to have a dramatization of something that we haven't quite left yet, and that, was profoundly devastating for a whole range of people. And what became clear is that people are already forgetting. And so we do have to go back and be reminded of those spaces where maybe we didn't occupy because we didn't have interactions with hospitals. We may have had other forms of trauma and pain and loss, but maybe that version we didn't know. And so for me, that conversation was a really good way of returning to this question of thresholds and tolerances. When is enough enough? When do we show? When do we tell? Which is at the heart of any kind of ethical inquiry with any kind of material, even if it's documentary material. And I think what I was trying to do in this particular piece was get primarily students and memory workers thinking about our tradition, the science of doing museum work, or the science of the humanities, still comes with this notion of neutrality, or this notion of the kind of objective God's eye. You come in, you analyze, you assess, you bring materials together, you prove, and then you and the person doing it has no interference with the data, right? And my point in that has been, like, if this is about information integrity, right? If we think about various kinds of collections, those collections themselves were produced by humans and they were completely flawed. And there's lots of mistakes that we are now revising in the original primary source material, using sort of historians' terms. So this notion that the collections we're looking at are neutral and we need to approach it with a neutral eye I think that can be thrown in the trash can. So there's that one thing, but then also just considering, how can we do this work in a way that that is sensible and that uses our skills meaningfully, but still makes room for the affect and all those consequences of engaging second or third or fourth hand with the scene of a crime. And I think this is something that we actually have to, it's not something that is like we don't have a rule book for that yet. And I don't think it's about rules. I think it's more about how do we develop a different kind of ethics of care for a decolonized or anti-colonial approach to materials that for so long have been held in this, this kind of, oh, this is objective information that we're just going to approach with a clean historical eye. So I think because our culture around these histories and how they affect our presence is changing, we now need to develop a different kind of ethical framework for this work. Hopefully that makes sense. Yeah.
Okay, we see hands going up. Yes, Melanie.
This is sort of a specific question for Jessica, but I think there's like a general question here for the roundtable too. And the general version is sort of picking up on a term that Jinha used, which was long-term, and thinking about long-term versus short-term impacts on well-being of library, museum, archive, work or research. But the specific question, I guess, Jessica, for your study is thinking about the duration of time that you're evaluating, that hour. And I'm really curious about like how you're thinking about that versus other possible durations of time that you could be evaluating, how might people's responses change that night or a week later or like a year later? Because in some ways you could think about, you might be interested in more lasting impacts on well-being, but I think it's also really interesting to think about those more immediate impacts. Sometimes when I go to a museum, immediately I'm kind of tired and cranky, but then maybe by the evening, I'm like in a more meditative state or something like that. And so, yeah, I just wonder if you could like speculate about those differences or just think about like that hour of time.
Yeah, I've done a lot of thinking about that. I think for me, there is some really good work that looks at the impact of museums, for example, on learning, on identity, that take a very long-term view, right? And show long-term impacts and the cumulative nature of that. I think for me right now, I'm sort of making this assumption that in that hour, something happens and that shift in feeling means something. I don't think it stays necessarily. I think that's true for most of our experiences as we move through a day. But if we can come to understand how that shift might happen in a museum, and then come to better see museums as places where, if I'm feeling this way, I can go to a museum and feel better, right? For a little bit of time, then I think we could start to build on that and say, okay, so are there then more lasting impacts in here? And what do those look like? I don't know. And are there cumulative impacts, across a community infrastructure? I don't know any of that. I figured since there's so little research, let's start and just see if an hour makes a difference and where we go from there. But I love all of those things you raised.
Actually, Jessica, what you just said about that shift in feeling meaning something, for me, that's how I'm considering this question of ethics. I mean, I'm thinking now of Eve Tuck and Kay Waynes Yang's work, where they talk about developing a sixth sense, right? And that those gut feelings are a kind of intuition that leads you towards an ethics of yes or no, or maybe. So I like the way you're framing of this shift in feeling, because that shift actually is information that we can use, not just in terms of thinking about how visitors experience collections, but also how we as practitioners do memory work. Yeah.
Temi, I keep thinking about, I'm trying to think if Apollo has seen this recording. A recording I have in a class for community engagement, and it's from Shanae Moraine, who is a outreach librarian for the soon-to-be demised DPLA. But what's so interesting about what she talked about is she was looking for evidence of something that we know happened, but there's no written evidence of it. It's because it's never been indexed, the terms were never used. And in order to go through and find information about Black suffragists, you had to get through a lot of harmful language and upsetting things and demeaning things to try and find these stories. And one of the things she said that I thought was interesting, and I wonder if you've had any encounter with this, is that the institutions that were engaged in looking through their own collections, I'm looking at you online, so I hope you know that I'm staring right at you. That who were doing this online, I know UC Berkeley was one of the collections, there were several, agreed on developing a process for how to address harmful language. When do you rename the term that's actually used? How do you talk about the terms that are there? But it really is interesting because it raises this question of how sacred, so to speak, is the material in its original form? Do we need to know people use this derogatory language? Or how much do we need to know it? And is it, sacrosanct to change it? So I'd love to hear your thoughts on, first of all, if you knew about this harmful language project, and secondly, what you think about changing history, basically. Does it look like it's cleaning it up and we're gonna cease to understand it? Go ahead, please.
I love this question, especially with MLI students in the room, because we've been talking about this for like 2-3 weeks. And they've been doing some critical cataloging and thinking about, how radical we can be in our corrections. Also, we've been talking with Connor Casey down in Special Collections about the labor archives and the corrective collections cataloging work that the University of Washington Libraries is doing to make collections more accessible. So yes, I am aware of this corrective movement. And the challenges of letting go of harmful, historical, racist, prejudiced, all sorts of things, language. But the erasures that can come where you don't know what came before. An example I can give is what happened while I was in Denmark, where a number of collections I think I've written about this in terms of the Statens Museum for Kunst. They decided to change all the titles that included the quote unquote N-word in Danish, which is still it's still being used in everyday language in a way that wouldn't happen here in the same way. And they decided that if the artist did not produce a title, and this title was the product of a history of collections management, that the title could be changed. But it happened without consultation. It was almost like, find the N-word, let's make a change. And it happened very quickly. And so that action in itself was also violent. And the words just kind of disappeared, as if nothing had happened, as if this language does not have affect and there's still not a public discourse that needs to be dealt with about actual lived experience of being called that now in 2024, never mind the historical material. So I'm currently, and this is, thinking about incommensurability, things can change, but currently my feeling is that it is important to see the archival layers, to see the cataloging layers, to see the knowledge organization evolve, because we do need to understand where we have been and who's been doing this work and how those changes are slowly taking place. But we also need a kind of careful curatorial practice for what happens on front end. So I guess what I'm thinking about is what is happening on the front end, what is happening on the back end, and how much of that is opened up to the everyday user, be it a researcher or just a member of the public who wants to find information. And this is complicated because it's literally collection by collection. Like, it's not like something you can just enact collections wide. But yeah, I do feel that, Hazel Carby did a project at Yale and described this work of trying to find material through these violent layers as imperial prospecting, which then brings our bodies into the space of the colonial surveyor in a way, in our work with collections. This is the direct link that was being made. But I think we have to accept, and this is the language that I'm talking about with our students, that we have to accept that we're implicated if we do this work. Yeah, but yes, I think being able to see the systems change is super important from my perspective.
Thank you very, very much.
Any other questions or comments? Yes, Lorcan.
I was wondering, Jessica, you mentioned literature and you mentioned theatre, so I was just thinking about general civic infrastructure and to what extent your results would you surmise might be similar or different if you were doing the study in a botanic garden, for example.
Yeah. Thought about that too, Larkin, I think there's a huge opportunity to do some comparative work there and really understand those differences. I think there's some basic literature that shows that experiences in nature and experiences with art play a critical role in well-being. And so there are times when I think you can probably make some decent hypotheses about what is going to happen there. I think it's also probably possible that there are differences between the nature and the art experiences, right? Last year I taught a class about museums, health and well-being, and the end of the last class we had, I brought together some folks across campus, including Jinha, Greg Bratman, who studies well-being in nature. And we had sort of a conversation like this, where we looked at well-being across these multiple contexts and tried to think about not only how we're measuring it similarly and differently, but whether the results where those are similar and different. And I don't know that we necessarily got to any concrete conclusions, but I would hypothesize that there are both similarities and differences, and that there are probably mechanisms in there that are different that we could learn from.
Yeah,
Different prescriptions in the UK for.
Hey, there you go, right?
Yeah, and just to add to that, I think there's something interesting about like these different organizations too, right? When you go to a museum, when you're going to like a botanical garden, you are already in that mindset of like, yeah, I'm gonna spend some time and do something for myself, right? I'm gonna go out and have some fun or relax or do things. I feel like library, on the other hand, is slightly different. For a lot of people, it's like a daily thing. For a lot of youth, it's like, that's where I go after my school is out. So I can avoid hanging out with my sibling who's really annoying. Or that's where I get like homework help, or that's where I like hang out with, other kids, right? So I think the mindset is slightly different, which means that like the kind of impact that they're gonna get is probably going to be somewhat different.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, I think so. I was thinking about how, the libraries have a similar kind of situation when you go in there and there's like this reverence to the stacks as when you go to the museums, but also has these spaces that are really vibrant and really dynamic. Like if you go into Lake City Library, for example, you see these big spaces, people are moving all over the place. So there is like that opportunity, I think, for libraries to create these spaces that are trying to help teams and especially like communities of marginalized communities into finding spaces that help them into thinking about well-being in ways that respect their culture, right? And I think that when we open this space of participatory design with the teams, we're letting them express their ideas. But the other thing that I think is really critical is how much we're learning about them through that process, right? So if we are asking them to create a collage, for example, of what a good space for them is, or what a not so welcoming space is, you're gonna find that, for example, that the political climate is really important to them, just through expressing while they're expressing in there, right? Or that authority and power dynamics also are a key factor for how they feel around the world. And then as you staff or a librarian, then you can then react to that and provide them the support that they really need into creating these communities that are strong. So different, but I think that the opportunity there for the libraries is really, really rich. And that's why I want this to like expand. We're working with like 6 libraries throughout the country now to test this and see how it continues working, and whether we need to adapt it to different contexts.
Okay, at this point, I think we're gonna shift from this format to more informal with lunch, but before we do that, I wanted to give Sharon a moment to share some concluding remarks.
Thanks, everyone, and thank you so much to our panelists today. What a rich session. I just put on the screen that we have some more of CALMA events already in the pipeline, and hope that you will consider joining us for those. And March 6th one will be a little bit different format, but one of a series that we plan to continue, which is a research and practice where we focus on a single project and process. And our guests will be a project led by the Northern New York Library Network. It's their focus is how do you calculate the value of libraries as community resources, primarily on public libraries. But even certainly those of you who are interested in public library work, we highly encourage you to attend. But I think we're going to also be looking at the design process for the project, which includes very strong participatory co-design. It includes both quantitative and qualitative research methods. And there's an economist on there who's coming up with a perspective. How do you calculate this sort of the value, which is not a monetary value, but a community impact value? So hope you'll join us. To stay informed about this, of course, they'll go through the listservs, but we just opened up a Slack channel on the iSchool workspace. So if you have access to the iSchool workspace, please join it. And you won't see much there, but we'll start feeding it. You're welcome to contribute readings or things that stimulated from this event as well. If you want to share research or publications that were referenced or for further reading, we'd really appreciate it. So that's my plug, and hope to see you soon, and have a great lunch.
Thanks, Sharon.
Thanks, Sharon. See you soon.
Thank you, Temi. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Design of experiments. Kind of